Okay, everyone. So I spent some time working on my own negative space painting, and you can see that I am painting in the positive as well. And as I was working, I was reminded that some of these things are very intuitive for me to do, but maybe not necessarily for you. You won't maybe think about some of these basic techniques you could use to create visual depth. So I wanted to go over some of these with you. And most of them are all just these fundamental basic skills that we've already practiced. So you should have an inventive background already done. You can tell by looking at mine that I used the warm colors, and then I threw salt on it. Actually just sprinkled some salt on it after I had done some wet on wet technique. And so then I also traced some leaves. I used faked leaves for this one. And I traced those. And I have at least 3. I would like you to create at least 3 layers of space. So what I wanted to do was to talk to you guys just a little bit about some of the most basic skills that you will need in order to make this work. So the first thing is we want to leave the things that are in the front, or things that we want to emphasize, or things that are just light in general. We want to leave them light. So this top leaf here, I'm not going to do anything to it. Instead, I'm going to darken the negative space that is around this leaf. And I have a second leaf that is here and it's underneath of it, and I'm going to darken that as well. So I'm going to pull a color from my color scheme. I'm going to add some water to it, and I'm going to use my Sumier brush here. And so what I'm going to do is just go in here, and I'm going to basically outline it with paint. And I'm going to cover over all of the background as well as that second leaf. And so that's going to darken it up. Now when you do this, there might be places you want to leave the light. So I'm just going to darken that leaf rather than continue with the negative space. But I'm going to go ahead and go in here and just define that shape of that leaf with some paint. So you can start to see how that's popping out. Maybe I'm going to go in with a little bit more so that you guys can see it even more here. And then one of the techniques I use a lot is then to kind of blend this color out into the background. So all I'm going to do is use some plain water, and I'm just going to do a gradation so that it basically fades to nothing into that background. You could maybe throw some texture into it too, if you wanted to, by using some paper towel in order to get some gradual transition. But notice how this leaf is now popping out because that is standing out. So remember that in this negative space painting, that you're going to want to start to darken and show some layers. So this little leaf that I darkened here, I darkened it with just plain orange. It doesn't look dark enough to me. So maybe what I want to do is either add more orange, or maybe I want to swap for a darker color in my color scheme. So I'm going to go in here and lay in some color so that once again you can see how this will then now stand out a little bit more from that top leaf here. So I'm using like a flat brush. There's already water down here. And then maybe if I want it to be less streaky, I can just pull that color down. And if I want it to be kind of blotchy, I can kind of do the wet on wet technique. Or if I want it to be smooth and flat, I can do the flat wash technique where I just go back and forth, and just be real careful to stay in the lines. I probably want to pick up any extra bead of paint with paper towel or with a dry brush to kind of eliminate it. Now, when I look at this space right here, there's not a very significant value change. And so another thing that you might want to do, especially once this is dry, is you might want to, in a way, darken the edge of it. So what I'm going to do is take some of my red orange and make kind of like a vermilion color here. Maybe I'm going to dull it down a little bit with green or blue, which is the opposite on the color wheel. So it's more of like a burnt orange. And I want there not to be too much water on this. And so what I can do is kind of bring a line. And I'm going to stop it there because this is really wet and I don't want it to bleed. And then what I can do is use some clean water so I can pull that down to kind of emphasize the contrast a little bit more. If it's not dark enough, maybe I use a smaller brush, even more color. And then just water. So just water, no color, and I can pull it down and then let it fade. So just like I did with this big section here where I had it fade, here I can make it so that's less of a line. So on the first top layers, I probably wouldn't do like contrasting color. What I mean by contrasting color is I wouldn't do like something opposite on the color wheel. Instead, I would really just focus on a color that is a darker version of something I've already used. Okay, but once you start getting into more and more darks, maybe you'd want to add some linear elements. Here you can see I added darks with like a green on top of the orange. So it will dull as well as darken the color in those areas. Now I was okay with that because it is a fall sort of theme and those colors tend to get brown. But if you don't want that, you're going to want to make sure you test out your color combinations before you begin to paint. Okay. This paint, let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and demo that dark to light again. I'm going to do it in this lighter section right here. So I'm going to go ahead and add an edge. And instead of just making it look flat, I'm going to go back and forth and kind of pull the color so I get a gradual transition where that color will bleed and then dissipate as it moves out. So to dissipate, maybe I even grab a brush, another brush that holds a little bit more water. So I don't necessarily add dark to all of my edges. Normally I'll pick a side, so like maybe just bottoms. To have that kind of pull forward and stand out. Another thing that you might eventually get to is adding details. So if I want to do some of the veins on here, I might use a liner brush or a thin brush to use some of these colors, just to add some of those linear details on top. You just want to make sure you use the right brush based on the size of your detail. Okay. So I still need this to dry, so I don't want to keep messing with this. Maybe I'll make another video with it later. But once that starts to dry, then you want to start building in some of your medium values and some of your darker values so that you can get even more visual depth. I'd like you to try to create at least 3 layers of color. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to have, leaf on top of leaf on top of leaf, but you want to be able to show at least 3 levels of space. So like have a little bit of overlap, have some background, and then choose which areas you're going to pull the dark. The entire background doesn't have to be dark, but you're going to want to have some darks to really pop out those lights and show more depth. Okay, so I wanted to go over once again some of those basic techniques. We've looked at how to add detail with linear elements, how to paint in the negative space, how to do gradation. Here I actually even overlaid the negative space with another color. I chose a contrasting color so that this leaf would even pop out some more. In this leaf right here, the second one, so we've got foreground, which is light, and then we've got our middle ground, which is getting darker because it's farther behind, and then the darkest part, which is our third level of space. I want to see about how I can create some more of this detail from this leaf. And so when I look at it, there's a gradual fade from orange to red orange to kind of like a alizarin crimson, almost purplish color. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is mix those colors in my palette. So I'm going to activate those colors for myself so that they've got some water in there. And then I want to think about what technique is going to work best for that process. So since there's a gradual transition, more than likely, I'm going to need something that has a wet on wet sort of technique. So what I'm going to do is start with some orange at the top, and I'm going to go ahead and paint it in. And then while it's still wet, I'm going to grab some of the darker color. So I start lighter, and I use that bead of color. I'm going to kind of pull it down. I want to just pay some really close attention to controlling that water so that I stay in the lines. And I'm going to leave the extra water in like the darkest places. And maybe in some places where it's maybe a little bit too much, I can sop it up with like a slightly drier brush. So while this is still wet, I'm going to go ahead and drop in some of that darker red, on the tips of this. And then I'm going to kind of let the paint do its own work. And maybe I want it to go a little darker here. So remember, for those variated washes, just kind of going back and forth, back and forth. And since this is wet, I can really manipulate the color for a while here. And then the last thing I'm going to do is on the tips of this, I'm going to go ahead and just drop in some of my color. And now since I'm dropping this in, I'm probably going to get some water blossoms. And I'm okay with that because I think that that's going to look great with my texture in the background. But if you don't want water blossoms to occur, maybe something that you want to do is to kind of pick some of that extra water up with a slightly drier brush.